Thank you for coming. I'm glad we had a turnout. I know we have a clerkship lecture today at the same time, so I was worried we wouldn't get any first years, but we did. So welcome to our lecture on gender identity in the law. I'm very happy to say we have Gunnar Scott who's an organizer and outreach coordinator from the network LaRed in Boston, Massachusetts. The organization's focused on ending abuse in lesbian, bisexual, women, transgender communities, and is a social justice-based organization. He's conducted workshops nationally on transgender issues, LGBT domestic violence, and he is the treasurer of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, a member of the GLBT Domestic Violence Coalition, on the Governor's Commission of Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault, and an education subcommittee of NCAVP, NCTE, GLLTF. And he's also published a variety of articles in many different literary magazines. And I'm very glad that he's here with us today. He's actually given a similar presentation at Harvard Law and Northeastern Law, and I'm very glad we're going to be able to see it today. And with that, just the last plug is that this evening, Gunnar is actually going to speak at the LGBT Center at 5 p.m. Dinner will be served, and the topic is on LGBT domestic violence. As I don't know how many of you are aware, but generally about 1 in 4 individuals in the span of their lifetime will be a victim of domestic violence. And that the same is true for LGBT folks, straight folks, poor, rich, whoever you are. The statistics are pretty much even across the board, but social services and kind of legal and political awareness about that really lack. And so I hope if any of you are able to, will join us at 5 p.m. at the LGBT Center. And with that, I'd like to have you join me in welcoming Gunnar Scott.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you all for having me here. It's very exciting to come down where there's no snow. We just had a blizzard in Massachusetts, so I like not having to wear a jacket. I'm going to spend the next hour or so talking about the transgender community, who's in the transgender community, who is considered under the transgender umbrella, what the law thinks about the transgender community. I'll just state for the record, I am not a lawyer. I've dated lots of lawyers, and I have a very good relationship with Northeastern Law School. Northeastern Law School actually helped to start the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, so they gave us space and also access to all their law students, and we have quite a few of their law students in our coalition. So. I am what some folks call a street advocate for folks, so often I get calls from people who are dealing with issues, sometimes in regards to the law, sometimes in regards to policies around different social service spaces, and so I try to basically break down the language of the law to language that people can understand. So that's kind of where I fall in that. First, we need to talk a little bit about sexuality, because I think one of the misconceptions about the term GLBT is that it all means the same thing: gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. And I know for some folks, they may be like, okay, I'm way past this section, but for folks who are just coming to learn about the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender community, it's important to talk about the differences of those two communities and why the T is kind of tacked on at the end of that. When we talk about sexuality, we're talking about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual folks. And at the network, we look at sexuality through 3 different components. Through sexual orientation, that's who you want, who you're attracted to. And that's been kind of the umbrella term for all 3 of them for a while. Sexual behavior, who you have sex with, what kind of sex you have. And then the identity label that you call yourself. And we break these down because for some of the people that I work with at the network, some folks may use a term that I might define as something other than what they're using it for. So for instance, we may be working with a woman who defines herself as heterosexual, but she's in a same-sex relationship at the time she's talking to us. And it's not for me to say, well, really, you're acting like a bisexual or a lesbian, and that's what you should call yourself. So it's about letting people self-identify and know that some of those folks, the self-identification label that they're using isn't necessarily matching up with what society's idea of that definition of the word is. So when we talk about transgender folks, we're looking at gender and gender identity. And gender identity or expression, and this is the definition we use for the Boston Ordinance in Boston. We have a non-discrimination ordinance in Boston, and the definition we used was, shall mean and include a person's actual perceived gender as well as a person's gender identity, gender-related self-image, gender-related appearance, or gender-related expression, whether or not that gender identity, gender-related self-image, gender-related appearance, or gender-related expression is different from that traditionally associated with a person's sex at birth. So for the law students in the room, that all probably sounds like legal language. And so what that really means to us when we're talking about it is that it's about somebody being able to self-define what their gender is. That when we're born, we're assigned a sex at birth, and it's usually within the gender binary construct, meaning that here in this culture we have two choices, male or female. And if you look at all the forms that you have to fill out, your driver's license, your birth certificate, the forms you probably filled out to get into law school, it's going to have two choices for you, male or female. And for many people, those two choices are fine, that they are within the box that they were assigned at birth, and they go on to kind of prescribe to some of the social stereotypes of what a man is or what a woman is. Although we don't all necessarily prescribe to those. I think there's an ideal in society that's been put out by the media about this is what a man is and this is what a woman is. And usually it's on the hyper-masculine end or the hyper-feminine end. But most of us, we're kind of somewhere in the middle of those. And some of us cross over those gender boundaries from time to time. Some folks do that more often than others. And sometimes the crossing becomes part of the social norm. And what I mean by that is that there are some social culture practices that have become, that were started off as people aren't supposed to do that, and now have become kind of the norm. My example of that is women wearing pants. That for a long time, it was inappropriate for women to wear pants. And as the years went by, it became more socially appropriate for women to wear pants. Why did this happen? Well, because they invented the bicycle, and you couldn't ride a bike with a skirt on. And so it became socially acceptable for a woman to wear pants while she rode her bike. And then once she got off the bike, she was supposed to put the skirt back on. And over time, that's changed. We've seen this recently with men wearing jewelry. My brother, who's a couple years younger than me, got his ear pierced when he was like 12 or 13. And the first things out of my dad's mouth was, what are you, a fag? What are you, a sissy? Because it wasn't really socially acceptable at that time for boys to have earrings. And nowadays, you see lots of men with 2 earrings, 1 earring, 3 earrings, 4, piercings all over their face, whatever. So it's become a little bit more socially acceptable. There are exceptions to this. There are definitely some religious communities that the social standard of men and women are set according to the religious community. There's definitely ethnic communities that have the same type of thing. But within the white media culture, so to speak, or pop culture, gender gets blurred. And some of the folks that blur gender are Michael Jackson, Annie Lennox, the guy from Twisted Sister, Marilyn Manson. And these are what we call gender nonconforming folks. Gender nonconforming is not necessarily folks who are identifying with the transgender community, people whose gender expressions don't match the stereotypes of what a man is or what a woman is. So for some people it's performance. For some folks it's their expression during a certain period. I mean, Annie Lennox isn't wearing a shirt and tie anymore, but she definitely still has the short hair. And so it's about somebody who's going outside those gender boxes. Gender nonconforming could be happening at Halloween. If you think about it, that's one of the biggest gender nonconforming holidays I think there is. Why we talk about gender nonconforming is because some folks who are gender nonconforming are targeted for hate or bias crimes. And usually it's assumed if you are gender nonconforming, then you're gay or lesbian. And that's not always the case. I've never heard Michael Jackson say that he's gay, or Marilyn Manson for that matter. So it's about your gender expression and how you're presenting your gender expression. Some folks who are gender nonconforming, it could be for just a moment. It could be just how that person presents their gender. Some people are discriminated against because of their gender nonconforming behavior or their expression. We had a case up in Massachusetts with a postal worker who was being targeted for harassment by his coworkers. And they were assuming that he was gay because he was a slender man, and he wasn't really masculine, butch kind of guy. And he was just kind of slender, and he talked with a very soft voice. And so they were making the assumption that he was gay, and they were targeting him for homophobic harassment. The gentleman was not gay, and he did take a suit against his coworkers, against the post office for not protecting him, I guess. I'm not quite clear, but he did end up winning that it was a form of harassment and that his post office was not doing anything to discourage what was going on. Transgender folks, transgender is an umbrella term that we hear for to cover a lot of different folks. The word transgender itself, some people do use that as their identity label as well. And transgender folks are those who are transitioning from one gender to another or expressing their gender outside the gender binary system. Transgender folks can identify their sexual orientation across the spectrum: heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual. And it was actually thought for a long time that most transgender people were straight. The reason for that was because if you were going to have sex reassignment surgery, you had to identify as heterosexual, both before the surgery and after the surgery. And this was about 15, 20 years ago. That's no longer the case. So we're starting to see more folks who are identifying across the spectrum. And it's pretty consistent with what we see with mainstream society. There isn't like an overwhelming number of folks who are gay and lesbian. It's about what we see in mainstream society. So crossdressers fit under this transgender umbrella, and that is somebody who's wearing the clothing opposite their gender, their birth gender or their birth sex, and usually not all the time. Crossdressers can identify as straight, lesbian, gay, bisexual as well. Crossdressers don't identify with the opposite gender, meaning they don't want to live as the opposite gender full time. How many women here have bought and worn men's clothing? You would all be considered crossdressers. But women aren't seen as crossdressers in our society. That's because, for the most part, it's socially acceptable for women to wear masculine clothing off and on, and that most crossdressers are identified as straight white men who dress in women's clothing. If you think about the films and the movies that have talked about either crossdressers or transsexuals, they're usually focusing on straight white men who are dressing in women's clothing or who want to be women in the film. Often, a lot of our early films were about crossdressers who were also serial killers. And there's actually, I don't think there's any serial killers that we can account for in our community. If anything, we have people who are perpetrating violence against transgender folks more often than transgender people perpetrating violence against non-transgender people. But for a long time, it was a very popular genre to have, such as Silence of the Lambs, Body Double. All of those films had some sort of character that was either a crossdresser or a transsexual, was kind of in a gray area. Some of the folks that fit under cross-dressing, so to speak, are drag queens, and that's somebody who's performing gender often as a impersonation of somebody who's pretty famous, like Madonna or Cher or Stevie Nicks. Stevie Nicks actually has a whole troupe of cross-dressers that follow her, or drag queens that follow her around the country. They made a documentary about it. RuPaul is probably one of the most famous cross-dressers. She had her own show on VH1 for a while. She's in the process of making a comeback. Yes?
Because I noticed you use the pronoun she with RuPaul. So I know a lot of people who are cross-dressed don't necessarily identify with the gender that they're dressing as, whereas you said she, so does RuPaul also?
Well, from cross-dressing etiquette, from spending time in the cross-dressing community, is that when somebody is dressed en femme, particularly men who are dressing as women, that they will use the pronoun of their presentation at that time. But that doesn't mean they're using the pronoun all the time. So if I was then to see them the next day and they were not dressed en femme or in female clothing, then I would be using their male name and their male pronoun for them. So that's kind of the etiquette within the cross-dressing community. The white, straight male cross-dressing community has a lot of social clubs, outings, and things like that. They're a little bit more organized, so to speak. In Massachusetts, we have one of the oldest cross-dressing groups, which is called the Tiffany Club, and they've been around for 26 years. There's conferences, boat cruises, golf outings, hotels. In fact, there's one here in North Carolina that is dedicated to the cross-dresser that you can go down, and they have closets full of clothing. Because many cross-dressers are not dressing all the time, and some of them are not out to their partners or out in their workplaces. And I'm actually going to talk about a couple of cases that involve cross-dressers a little bit later on. Yes?
Sorry, one more. So for someone who has very little experience or exposure to the trans community, cross-dressing, drag, What kind of would response would you have for someone being like, well, yeah, we have these gender roles, and yeah, we kind of cross them, but like, why do it? Like, I mean, if someone, what kind of, because I think a lot of people have just don't really, you know,
Understand?
right.
Yeah.
Right. So what, like, everyday conversation, how would you answer that question?
Well, you can ask as many questions as you want. Anyone can ask questions. Why people cross-dress is a lot of different reasons. I think the DSM-4, which is the statistics manuals for diagnosing mental health disorders, talks about that people are cross-dressing for a sexual fetish. And I think that really just lumps those folks into one category. But there are lots of folks who cross-dress for lots of different reasons. Some folks talk about it that for them it's relaxation. Particularly the straight cross-dressing community talk about that when they are cross-dressed, then they don't have to have on that armor of what a man is supposed to be. That for them to express their femininity, this is how they do that. And that in our society, for men particularly, it's difficult to express your femininity because it's seen as you're saying to the world you want to be less than. Because women and femininity are still seen as less than in this society. And so why would a man want to give up his power, so to speak? Some folks talk about it that it's for them it's playfulness, performance, and that's what we see particularly with drag queens or drag kings. Other folks it's about a fetish, for a sexual fetish for some people, but that's actually a smaller percentage anecdotally that I've met, and that more folks talk about it being able to express that feminine side, that femininity that they feel in themselves that they don't get to do in their everyday life, so to speak. Some folks, most cross-dressers do not want to identify as full-time as the opposite gender or the opposite sex. There are some folks who start off cross-dressing and eventually transition and would be considered transsexuals. But I think that's one of the stereotypes is that you start off cross-dressing, then eventually you're going to transition, and that's not the case with everyone. The book, which is up here, My Husband Betty, is probably one of the better books talking about cross-dressing. It was written by the wife of a cross-dresser, and she interviewed, I think, over 100 folks who are in the cross-dressing community that she met. And they all talked about different reasons on why they cross-dressed. And some of the folks were out to their partners, some folks were not. Some folks were out at work and some people were not. The majority of cross-dressers that I know are typically not out at their job, and only about half of them or so are out to their partners. For some people, their wives, and again, these are the straight cross-dressers that I'm talking about, some of their wives are very accepting of it and will, come along to the conferences and things like that, and others are not so accepting and see it as, like, that's the thing you go do on the weekend, but I don't want the kids to know about it. And for some, it becomes, if the relationship does dissolve, it can become an issue that the wife might be using this against her husband or her partner to gain custody of the children. We often see that as a threat, that if they're going to expose them. And typically, folks who are transgender or cross-dressing dealing with family law don't often fare very well. The majority of folks that I know often lose custody of their kids, don't have visitation, and the courts are just not understanding when it comes to issues around family. So that's been our experience with folks. Genderqueer is a newer term that we've heard come out in about the last 10 years or so. Genderqueer often is attributed to people who are younger, like in college age, and it's often attributed to people who are female-born or female-bodied. It's somebody who identifies or expresses their gender outside the gender binary system. They might be fluid with their gender presentation, or they may not be conforming to gender norms or gender stereotypes. Some folks are expressing a gender opposite their birth, sex, or gender, a little bit like one end of the female-bodied person who's expressing a masculine gender presentation, or a male-bodied person expressing a female or feminine gender presentation. Some of the folks are using gender-neutral pronouns such as ze or here, and some folks try not to use any pronouns. Some folks use both pronouns. Some folks prefer that you use their name and then they as a way to talk about them. Some of the folks who are genderqueer will do medical transition, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a minute. And some folks may not. Some people change their birth name, some don't. It sounds really vague. It is. This is one of the few terms, I think, that was developed by the community for the community. A lot of the language around transgender and transsexual was given to us by often well-meaning doctors. And so they had definitions already attached to them. And this is one of the few words that we've seen come out that is about coming from the community, that is not coming from a medical kind of model. In 5 years, the definition of this word could change. I've seen it shift over the last 10 years. I've been tracking it myself since I started to first hear it, which was about 7 years ago. And I'm starting to see more folks. For a long time, it was mostly female-bodied people who were masculine presenting, but weren't necessarily identifying as a man. And now I'm starting to meet people who are male-bodied and feminine presenting, but not using the word woman to describe themselves, but will say, that I'm a feminine person, and really staying away from either male or female. In some youth communities of color, we hear words like femme queens, butch boys, drags, and other types of language that are talking a little bit about being genderqueer and kind of expressing both femininity and masculinity. It's not unusual to be at a transgender conference and see somebody who's masculine presenting with glitter and eyeliner on, and running around like in that, like mixing those types of things up. And then the last term I'll talk about is transsexual, and I think that's the one that some people have heard that often gets focused on, particularly right now. There's a movie out called Transamerica, which talks about the experience of a middle-aged white trans woman who's in the process of transitioning. And transsexual is somebody who is transitioning to live and identify full-time opposite their assigned sex. And I look at it through the social transition, and not necessarily focusing just on the medical transition. And I think that's important to note, because for folks who are transitioning, it's about how they're presenting themselves to the world and matching up their mind with their body. And for some people, that process can include medical transition, but that's not the case for everyone. I think the biggest myth or misconception about the transsexual community is that all transsexuals want to have sex reassignment surgery. And the reality is that less than 10% of transsexuals actually do go forward with full sex reassignment surgery. But if you look at a lot of the bases of state and local laws, particularly around changing identity documents, they base it on sex reassignment surgery. So the social transition is for somebody to transition and identify as that gender. And that can include changing your name. And that doesn't mean that you're legally changing it for everyone. If you've had a prior convictions or prior arrests, that you may not be able to legally change your name. There are certain states where judges have been notorious for not allowing name changes for transsexual folks. For some people, they may have a gender-neutral name, and so they may not have to change their name. They may also have pressure from family or friends not to change their name. So it's about, again, it's not in stone that that person has to change their name. The person's dressing in the clothing of the gender they identify with. Now, if we think about clothing in our culture, it's getting kind of gender neutral. I mean, if you go into the Gap or Old Navy, I don't know if you have those around here, but really, both sides are kind of looking the same. Khaki pants are khaki pants, So what does it mean to dress in the clothing of the gender that you identify with? For some people, someone who's going male to female, that might be dressing particularly feminine. I think the expectations often is, if you're a transsexual woman, that you should be dressing as feminine as possible. Hose, heel, skirt, eye makeup, the whole 9 yards. And for other folks, they may feel like, I didn't transition to look like a Barbie doll. I transitioned to feel comfortable in my body. But there's often a bar that's set for somebody who comes out as transsexual, particularly male to female transsexuals accessing women's spaces. That it's all about the passing and what you look like and what kind of woman are you presenting as. And then for folks who are on the F to M spectrum, or female to male, jeans and a t-shirt is jeans and a t-shirt. And so what is a masculine, clothing? It could be that somebody's wearing a shirt and a tie and a suit all the time. So the person is using the pronouns of the gender they identify with, and that they may or may not be doing the medical model of transition. And I'm going to talk what that is. So male to female is somebody who is born male and transitions to live full-time as female. And this can happen at any point in their life. For some people, it may happen early on. For other folks, it's when they're 50 or 60 years old. Recently, there was a book out by Jennifer Finney Boylan, who's a college professor up at Colby, and she transitioned. I think she's close to like 50. And we do have a crop of transsexual women who all transition when they're close to 50 or 60, when they're about ready to retire. And a lot of them talk about why they do that. It's because society basically said, you know, your job as a man is to grow up and to get a good job and to raise a family and be secure and make sure your family's secure. And some of them talk about that when they get to retirement, that this is their time. And so they've done what society wants them to do, so now they're taking the rest of their lives to do what they want to do, which is to transition. Other folks can transition at a younger age. We have people now all different ages. I think the stereotype for a long time was somebody who was like in their mid 30s or 40s that started to transition, but we're now seeing folks as young as 14, 15, 16 years old, some folks 7 or 8 coming out. Medical transition for both M to F and F to M follow some of the same patterns, and this comes from the Harry Benjamin Standards of Care. And that is a policy guideline that was set up by a Dr. Harry Benjamin, that was a guideline about what it would be like for somebody to transition and who would help them through this, who would guide them through this, and what's this process. And the first thing that folks would need to do if they're going to medically transition is to find a gender therapist. And that gender therapist is going to be their guide through this process. And that's the person that's going to help someone decide whether or not they're going to go on hormones, whether or not they want to have sex reassignment surgery, maybe help them talk about coming out with their family or their friends. And gender therapists run about $100 to $400, $100 or so a session. And when someone first starts this process, they may want to see the person each week. And so you're talking about $400 a month to do that. And the reason I have prices up there, and I'm talking about that, is because none of this is covered by health insurance. So folks are paying for this out of their pocket. There are definitely creative loopholes that people find to cover things, particularly if you have a therapist who might put down something like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder or some other diagnosis to cover some of this. But some folks are able to do that, some people are not. So you would find a gender therapist. Not all therapists do gender therapy. In Massachusetts, we have about 12. I actually didn't look to see how many were down here, but I can't just think there'd be more than 10, if that. The male to female transsexual woman would start doing electrolysis, or the hair removal of facial hair, and that can run you about $50 to $100 a week, or you could do a laser hair removal, which is about $800 or $900 a session, and you do that 2 or 3 times. And then after a few months, approximately, it depends for each person, but they say about 3 months or so, if that person's decided they want to go on a hormone replacement therapy, they would talk that over with their therapist and begin that process. You would need to find an endocrinologist who would do a series of tests on your liver and other functions to make sure that you're healthy. And not all endocrinologists will do that. I think that's one of the harder things for us to find is competent endocrinologists. In Boston, we have quite a few, we have like 12 gender therapists, and we have like 2 endocrinologists that will work with transgender folks. And their waiting lists are quite long. So for somebody who's male to female, they're going to start estrogen replacement therapy, and then also probably spironolactone, which is testosterone blocker. The sex reassignment surgery, there's 2 different options. There's the vaginoplasty, which is creating a vagina from the penis, and that starts at about $20,000 plus an additional $5,000 or so for any kind of follow-up surgery. If you're really into surgeries and watching them, the Discovery Channel is totally fascinated with transsexual surgery, and they have quite a few that you can watch. And there's approximately 3 or 4 surgeons here in North America that do this surgery. Colorado, Canada. There's some in Thailand as well. So most people often have to go out of their home state to have surgery, and they're staying there for about 2 weeks or so. The few folks that I do know that have had sex reassignment surgery, lower genital surgery, they talk about that for them that was the best decision they made because it was about finding the place that they were comfortable in their body. Many of those folks have saved up for this surgery all their lives, for years and years and years. I mean, again, the misconception is once somebody comes out that they're going to transition like within a year or 2. We've definitely had enough books and movies and things like that who have led to believe that that's how it works, but that's not actually the case. The other option is an orchiectomy, which is the removal of the testes. And somebody who is not going to have the lower genital surgery, they often are suggested they have an orchiectomy because the concern that we have is what the impact of hormones is on a person's body over long term. There are no real good long-term studies on hormone use on transsexual folks. Holland has done a few studies, but they haven't been quite long-term. So the concern is what is happening to your liver being on estrogen and this testosterone blocker. So they suggest if you're going to stay on hormones for a significant amount of time and you're not going to have lower surgery, that you should have an orchiectomy so that you can stop the reduction of testosterone. And so that's about $500 to $2,000. Some folks might do a breast augmentation. Some folks might do facial feminization surgery, which is actually becoming quite popular. But the average cost for medical transition, including the lower, the lower surgery, is about $24,000 when you're said and done. Most people spend more than that. And if you think about $24,000, like how many people just have $24,000 laying around in the bank? I mean, I don't know a lot of people who do. And again, the average time if you did have your $24,000 is going to be closer to 2 years for this to occur. The other piece around this is that for some people, they might feel like their surgery choice is not what the law says or what their HMO says. That for some people, facial feminization surgery is their transition surgery. Because if you think about it, what if folks base your gender on? Your appearance, and not necessarily your genitals. I mean, how many people walk around without pants on? Or they'd be in jail if they did that. So for some people, it's about that their face or their, having breast augmentation is more important to them because they're getting those visual cues. I mean, that's why people do hormones. It's about getting the secondary sex characteristics, and so appearing feminine, and that so that in the world, when they're walking through the world, that the world is seeing them as they see themselves. Female to male folks have it a little bit easier, not too much, but a little bit. We still have to do a lot of similar things, going to see a gender therapist. Our hormone would be testosterone, and that runs you about $100 a month or so. And our sex reassignment surgery is not the lower surgery, it's a top surgery or a chest surgery. And that's reconstructing the chest. And that runs about $7,000 to $11,000 depending on who you see. There are quite a few more surgeons who will do a top surgery versus a bottom surgery. And then some of the folks will do a hysterectomy, again, because there is concern of what is happening with taking large doses of hormones. And if you do a hysterectomy, then you can cut your hormone dosage in half. Most FMs do not do a bottom surgery. The bottom surgery for M to Fs was developed for a male-bodied person. The bottom surgery for an F to M, for a female to male, was not developed for a female-bodied person. It was developed for somebody like John Boppitt, who had an unfortunate accident where his penis was cut off. So the bottom surgery is not that great. It's also extremely expensive, and it's not necessarily, it's more about aesthetics as opposed to function. There's two types of surgery. There's a metoidioplasty, which is basically releasing the clitoris from the hood, and that costs you about $10,000 because once you've been on testosterone, your clitoris does enlarge, and it can get as large as 4 centimeters. And some other folks, the other option is a phalloplasty, or as we call it in the community, the frankenpenis. It's really not functionable, it's not attractive, and it's extremely, the one person I know that's had it, he spent close to $70,000, and it took him about 7 years because they do a lot of skin grafts, and they don't always take. So for us, our surgery is a top surgery. And why I go through all this is because when we're looking at trying to change laws, particularly around changing identity documents, the folks who are making these rules don't necessarily have an understanding of surgeries. In Michigan, for a while, the rule was if you were F to M, you had to have both a phalloplasty and a vaginoplasty. So that means you had to have both a penis and a vagina. And so it totally did not make any sense. And again, that was because the folks who were making up the rules had no understanding of the community and what kind of surgeries were out there. For us, again, it's about $24,000 if you're going to have surgeries. And most of the folks I know are not having that bottom surgery. So why we use the social or live full-time model is because for some people, they may not be able to medically transition. The first one is financial ability. That for some folks, they're not going to have that financial ability to pay for sex reassignment surgery. For some people, they may not even be able to afford hormones after a year or two, depending on their employment status, their economic status. For some folks, it could be health reasons. If you're HIV positive, you can have hormone replacement therapy, providing that your T cells are good. But if your T cells drop, then you may be asked to go off hormone therapy. You're not eligible for sex reassignment surgery. If you have hepatitis, you may not be able to go on to hormone replacement therapy. High blood pressure, high cholesterol, and other health reasons would preclude somebody from either hormone replacement therapy or from having sex reassignment surgery. If you're not a citizen of the U.S., you're going to have difficulty just accessing healthcare in general, particularly if you're not here legally. And you may not be able to legally change your name, or if you're here on a green card, you may not be able to change your name until you have permanent status in our country. For some folks, it's personal reasons. For some people, it's about what the person looks like, how they look. And other folks, they think about, like, what is my sexual function going to be like after I have sex reassignment surgery? For some folks, that, the 80% chance that you're going to have good sexual function is enough for them to go forward with a sex reassignment surgery. For other folks, they may be like, you know what, I don't want to mess around, and there could be a 20% chance I'm not going to have sexual function or sexual feeling. For some folks, that's a reason not to do that. And other folks may have religious reasons on why they do not go through with a medical transition. Passing is the ability not to be recognized as a transsexual or your former gender. Some folks who have transitioned may no longer even use the term transsexual for themselves. So they may have called themselves a transsexual during that transition time, but once they started to pass and got to a point in their lives where nobody maybe knew that they were their former gender, they may not be calling themselves that, and we call that stealth. That we have folks in our community who are stealth, who are not out about being transsexual or been born a former gender. And people do this for a lot of different reasons. A lot of times it's emotional and physical safety. For some folks, it's so they can keep a job and keep, earning money and being able to live in an apartment or a house. For some people, they may be with a partner who, says, I don't want our children to know, whatever it might be. So there's a lot of discussion in the community about should people be stealth, should they be out. I think being attached to the GLB community, a lot of the work has been done about GLB folks should come out because people will get to know GLB folks, and then people won't be so afraid, blah, blah, blah. But for trans folks, that can have a significant impact, and that could be safety, that could be physical safety, that for some people when they come out to family or friends or coworkers, that their lives could be in jeopardy, and that has been shown. It's not to say it doesn't happen with gay and lesbian folks, it does happen as well. And then the other piece is that the legal piece around it is that a lot of states don't have non-discrimination laws that are covering trans people, so they can be fired for being transsexual. And there are quite a few cases that we're going to talk about. So changing identity document, there's no such thing as we don't have like a federal gender, so to speak, at this point, although that may change very shortly, depending on what act is passed by Congress at what time. But at this point, each state and each federal branch has a different way of changing gender on your identity documents. Each procedure is different, each requirement is different, and it can vary state to state, city to city, town to town. For driver's licenses, some driver's licenses will require, some registry of motor vehicles will require that the person has sex reassignment surgery and that they have an amended birth certificate and a legal name change. Some only require a letter from a licensed healthcare provider stating that this person is living full-time this gender. If you get a driver's license in California where that's the requirement that you just need a letter from a healthcare provider, and you had a previous license in Massachusetts where you need to follow SRS and an amended birth certificate, and they bring up your old information, they'll change your gender back. We've had that case happen. So we had a trans woman who was living in California. She had an F on her driver's license in California. She came back to Massachusetts and they said, oh, you don't have a surgery letter, so we're going to put an M on that. So states can kind of make up their own rules as they go along. The REAL ID Act requires certain things on a driver's license. I mean, there have been things required on a driver's license for a while, mostly commercial driver's licenses, and then a lot of states adopted what they wanted to see on on the driver's license. The requirements on a CDL are gender, age, picture, and then states then also adopted the same requirements. So for some of our folks, we're walking around with identity documents that don't match our presentation, which can be very disconcerting for the person that has that, as well as people that might be asking for identity documents. For folks who want to do a legal name change, I talked about this before, but some people may be in a state that it may be very difficult. They might need to hire an attorney to do the legal name change. In Massachusetts, it's pretty easy to get a name change. It does cost $175 at this point, but you don't even have to go in front of the judge. You just go in, you petition for it, and the judge signs off on it. New Hampshire, the judges have been notorious about not allowing name changes for transsexuals. So we've had folks coming down from New Hampshire into Massachusetts to be able to do that. And then most states require that you get a legal name change before changing the name on a driver's license too. So that may be difficult for somebody. Social Security. Social Security officially requires that the surgeon or attending physician provides a letter verifying the sex change surgery has been completed. What does that mean, completed? That's very varying. There's no completed being that M to Fs have to have vaginoplasty, F to Ms have to have phalloplasty. It's just that's the wording of it, and it really depends on the clerk at the Social Security office. We have had folks who have gone in with their letter from their surgeon, and because it doesn't say completed, they've rejected it, even though they've spent their $25,000. We've had other folks go in, and the clerk, for a name change without a letter from the surgery, and the clerk has gone, this doesn't look right because the person is passing as the gender they identify with, and the clerk goes, oh, they must have made a mistake and didn't change the gender on the Social Security card or the driver's license. We have that happen all the time. The other interesting thing that's been occurring is that the Social Security office has been mailing letters to employers letting them know that their employee had a different gender at some other point in their lives, which is then outing folks. Again, for some people, this can be quite dangerous. We've had a couple of people who have lost their job because the Social Security Administration sent them a letter. They've also done things like if you've changed your name, well, hold up your driver's license, your renewal of your driver's license. So this is quite problematic for some folks. Passports, you can get a temporary, one-year passport if you are going to have sex reassignment surgery within that year with your new gender on it. You then need to provide to the federal government an order saying, a decree saying you've had a legal name change, as well as a certified copy of a new birth certificate, and to get that you need to have sex reassignment surgery. So the passport folks follow kind of the same driver's license standards around that. But there are certain states that will not allow you to change your birth certificate. Florida, Idaho, Ohio, and Tennessee do not allow people to amend their birth certificate. So if you're born in those states and you want to change your passport, you're screwed, which pretty much comes down to it. Some states have provisions in their state laws around what you need to do to change your birth certificate. Massachusetts happens to be one of them. You need to have a letter stating you've had completed sex reassignment surgery. Again, it's pretty vague on what completing sex reassignment surgery is. So birth certificate amendments are a little tricky, and I suspect that Kansas and Texas are probably in the process of changing theirs because of the two cases that occurred there, where they had one case in Kansas was the Gardner case, Joelle Gardner, who was legally married to a man. She had completed her sex reassignment surgery, had an amended birth certificate, all the documents that you can amend, she did. She got married to a non-trans man. He passed away, and his children contested the will, which left her a lot of money. And then Kansas said, you know what, that was a same-sex marriage. We're not going to, so you were never legally married. We saw the same thing happen with the Christy Littleton case in Texas. So issues around trans folks and getting married are different across the country as well. Yes?
If you were in charge, what's the perfect solution? Is it allow folks to change your will in terms of the binary male, female, or just to dump that entirely and come up with a third, or fourth, or fifth category?
My personal feeling would be that we don't have gender on things. I don't understand
Is there any value? Can you see any value for that kind of categorization?
No, I mean, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think about sex segregated spaces, but I think, that's me personally. Professionally, as an activist, I would say that we should have, people should get letters from licensed healthcare providers saying they're living full-time in that gender and not have a surgery requirement. Because I think the one person or the person in your life that's going to not understand you is going to be your healthcare provider. And so that I don't think we should be basing things on surgery or birth certificate amendments because there are going to be plenty of folks who are not ever going to meet those requirements for the variety of reasons I've talked about. So a letter from a licensed healthcare provider. And working, the other piece that always comes up, well, if you do that and this person gets arrested, how are they going to know what cell to put that person in? We already deal with all of that kind of stuff now with the mess that we have at this point. And so the other piece around sex segregated spaces is that it's very disruptive to have somebody who's female presenting in a male side of a homeless shelter. It's disruptive for the shelter itself. It's also extremely unsafe for that trans woman. What ends up happening a lot of times is that she's targeted for violence within that side of the shelter, and then she's also targeted for violence after she leaves, because then she's now outed to all these folks who are accessing that space. And so the solution has been to allow people who are feminine presenting, female identified, to be on the women's side of a shelter, regardless of their genitals, and someone who's male or masculine presenting to be on the men's side of a shelter. Because a lot of times, a lot of the sex segregated spaces, those are designed for people who are economically not, don't have any money. If you think of all the services that are often sex segregated, they're for folks who are in poverty. And so we're making these requirements for surgery for people who don't have access to money. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So the non-discrimination laws, yes?
You mentioned a moment ago where the judge, he said that the judge deemed it a same-sex marriage, was therefore void.
Yep.
Was that an intestate scenario? I mean, was there a will, or?
There was a will.
So
They voided the will.
will?
Yep. The husband who passed away, he left a significant amount of money to her. And so the two grown sons, who he did not leave that much money to, were contesting the will, and then contesting their marriage.
Okay.
The
I'd
case
be
in-
curious to know what grounds, other than, because you can leave your things to a same-sex partner, will, anybody can contest a will for.
That he
a
wasn't of
reason.
sound mind, I think, is what the sons were trying to state. Because why would their father ever marry a man? That he was never gay. And in some cases, and part of their argument was right, because this gentleman did not identify as gay. He identified as straight. His wife also identified as straight. She happened to be a transsexual. She was post-operative transsexual. So again, it was kind of like mixing up the GLBT and putting that, this trans person is obviously gay, and not really looking at the different parts of the community. Yes, in the back.
That employment situation that you described, where the employer somehow found out that this individual, used to live as a different sex, it's really troubling. I don't know if there's been lawsuits. Maybe you could talk about that, because it seems like that presents, Title VII issues.
Yep, I'm going to talk about those.
And then also, the courts are interpreting that the Constitution provides a zone of privacy, and how that might play out. Also, I guess
I'm going to talk about.
Great, thanks.
Yes.
When you say that you talked about the trans woman and you said that she was straight, does that mean, what does that mean?
She identified her sexual orientation as heterosexual, meaning that she primarily dated opposite gendered people, so she dated men. She identified as female, and she dated men. The other piece I didn't talk about is that for some people, their sexual orientation changes with their gender change, and for some people it does not. The partner, or the gender of the partner changes. But there's no scientific uniform code I can say that this is how it happens.
I guess I was just curious, are most people that are transsexuals or have had gender reassignment surgery, are their partners usually also transsexual, or are they usually?
It's different across the board.
Okay. And
There are some folks who, some male to female transsexuals who were married, were being identified as heterosexual men, were married to women and continued to stay married, had their sex reassignment surgery, and their partner, they stayed together and they're still legally married. And there have been legal same-sex marriages throughout this country for quite a long time because of scenarios like that. There are other folks who their relationship doesn't survive, or the person's sexual orientation changes, and their attraction changes with their gender change. So it's different across the board. There's been a couple of cases. There was one in Ohio with a female to male transsexual who was originally from Massachusetts. He had a Massachusetts birth certificate. He had a birth certificate amendment. He had a driver's license change. So all of his identity documents showed that he was male. He married his partner in Ohio, his female partner. So they were a straight couple. He went into court for something else. I'm not even clear on what it was, but the clerk was reading him as female and started doing a little investigation work and brought to attention that he was born female at one point. And so that their marriage was annulled by the state and was declared a same-sex marriage. So we've seen a couple of cases like that. And then there was a case in the Midwest, I can't remember which state, but it was 2 trans people, both trans women, and one already had completed her sex reassignment surgery and the other one had not. And they attempted to get a marriage certificate, and the court was saying that they were trying to commit fraud because they were both male to female transsexuals, but one had an F and one had an M. So it's a little bit of a mess, so to speak. Massachusetts, we don't really have to worry about that so much anymore because we have same-sex marriage, but the situation that comes up for us now is what happens when one of the partners legally changes their gender, and previously they were married as a same-sex couple, but now they're married as an opposite-sex couple. And it really, what I talk about is what's the less fraud and who's going to go to jail for what, and mostly with IRS tax purposes because the federal government doesn't recognize the same-sex marriages when it comes to taxes. So that's a question that my trans attorneys have yet to answer because I don't think we've been faced with that one yet, at least not publicly. So explicit legislative protections, we have them in California, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Minnesota, New Mexico, and Rhode Island. Minnesota was actually the first state to include gender identity and gender expression in non-discrimination law. The situation with Minnesota, though, is that this law passed in 1973, and recently there was a case with a trans woman, male to female, who was trying to access a women's restroom and was thrown out of it. The court then said that when they wrote this law, they could have never meant that trans women could use women's rooms. So if you are in Minnesota and you're a trans woman or you're a trans man, you can't use the bathroom of the gender that you present in because unless you have changed all your documents. We have court or administrative protections in other states, Connecticut, DC, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, and Vermont. Vermont is actually in the process of passing a non-discrimination law statewide. We expect that to happen within the next year or so. And then we have no statewide protections in 77, in the rest of the country. And then in 77 counties and towns, there are non-discrimination ordinances in place, such as in Massachusetts, in Boston, Cambridge, and Northampton. The situation with ordinances or city laws is that often there's nothing in place to then enforce them. Some cities might have a human rights commission that can enforce it, and usually it's a fine or something to that nature. In Cambridge, like it's a $300 fine if you discriminate against a trans person. And then often it's then sent up to like the Commission Against Discrimination, which can take years and years and years. Hate crimes law, we do have hate crimes law in some of the same states, and then other states do have hate crimes law that don't have a non-discrimination law. So California, Connecticut, Ithaca, Hawaii, Minnesota, Missouri, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And there's a lot of controversy about hate crimes law in regards to GLBT folks. There has been a federal bill around hate crimes that's been around since the early 90s, and this year, or actually in 2005, was the first year that we saw gender identity, gender expression added to that on the House side of the bill. The Senate side of the bill does not include transgender folks. And then in general, we see approximately one trans person murdered a month from hate violence. These are the statistics for the last couple of years, and these are folks I would not call them scientifically accurate statistics. This comes from the Remembering Our Dead website that tracks transgender violence through newspaper reports. I believe that this number is probably higher, but because newspapers don't always accurately report someone, and they even take the reports of a man found in a dress murdered type of thing. But I don't believe everyone is correctly reported. We did have a trans woman who was murdered in Boston last fall, and she was never reported as a transsexual woman in any of the papers. She was post-operative, and we believe she was murdered not because she was a trans woman, but she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that she was robbed, and she was in a high crime area. So we don't believe she was targeted for trans violence. So does that count around trans violence against, trans hate violence? This is the first time we've actually had to have that conversation, like, do we include her, do we not include her? She was a trans woman, she was murdered, but it was not because she was trans, or are we totally clear that's why? So it's hard to tell. Murders often have overkill, multiple stab wounds, shootings. Often, Rita Hester, who was a trans woman who was murdered in Boston back in 1998, she was stabbed 37 times in the chest. So those are the types of, including Gwen Araujo, who was kicked, stabbed, bludgeoned, and then buried in a shallow grave. So we see, one on top of another on top of another. Our conviction rates for trans murders are quite low. And those who do get convicted usually get less than 10 years in prison. The Gwen Araujo case is pretty significant because it's the first time that we've had convictions for 15 years to life for a trans murder. So that we've seen a shift now that the courts are starting to take this a little bit more seriously. The few folks, we've had 5 murders in Massachusetts, and one of them, the murderer got 7 years. He was in for 4, and he's now out free for murdering a trans woman. Yes?
Last year and the year before, I don't know if you're familiar with the cases, but they, there's been, it's very controversial in the last 20 years of cases bringing up a gay panic.
Yep. They're actually trying to pass a bill now in California to ban the gay panic or the trans panic defense, where that is, and we saw this with the Gwen Araujo case, where the defendants were saying that they didn't know that she was male, she had a penis, and that it grossed them out because they thought that she was trying to make them gay. But it's the excuse that's used on why people justify their actions around murdering or their reaction to finding out or discovering, so to speak. The case in Boston where the gentleman got less than 7 years for Chanel Pickett. Chanel Pickett was in a known trans club. It was like a drag club. And he had previously dated several other trans women from that same club. And at the time, there were 3 drag clubs in Boston. And he was well-known patron of all 3 of those clubs. And it was very obvious, the folks that were there. But he used the gay panic defense and was able to get less than 7 years because of that. So some of the case law, there's no established protections under federal laws that prohibit discrimination on basis of handicap or disability. Some state courts and administrative agencies have found that transsexualism is protected disability under their state laws. We have this in Massachusetts. And the case in Massachusetts was Lye versus Sky Publishing, and then Enriquez versus West Jersey Health System. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just putting these up there for you if you want to research them. And there's actually an article that I had sent to Emily, if people are interested, that goes through all of the good and the bad case law around trans law. Federal sex discrimination law, Title VII, and the first one was Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, and this prohibits an employer from discriminating against a woman who was considered to be too masculine. Yes?
I think the sort of rhetorical damage it does to call being transsexual, transgendered a disability.
There's a lot of debate in the community. There's debate in the community about whether we should have a diagnosis in the DSM-IV, which is gender identity disorder. There's debate about whether we should be under a disability, and there's debate of whether we should be under sex discrimination.
Seems like the first 2 would definitely continue to marginalize.
Right. Although there are some people who are getting some things covered because of it. So, ultimately, we would like to see it around gender identity. Federally, we don't use the expression gender expression because the ACLU folks are not so big on us using that. They think it gets too confusing. So we use gender identity, non-discrimination based on gender identity. Although the situation for some transgender people is because of the level of harassment and violence and trauma they experience, being trans does affect their mental health. That we do have, I think, a larger percentage of trans folks who are dealing with multiple mental health issues going on. And there's always the question, did they have this mental health issue before they came out? Was this a part of being trans? It's hard to kind of break all those pieces out. Dealing with day-to-day harassment and violence does take a toll on a person's mental health, dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and other things like that. So could that then impede somebody from working full-time job? Is that considered disability? I don't know, it's hard to say. Where's the line that you draw? The problem with this is that, some courts are interpreting it this way but the Americans with Disabilities Act don't cover transgender, transsexual folks. It explicitly excludes trans folks. So it's kind of a mess. That's what I have to say about it. The Rosa versus Park West Bank, which was reinstating Equal Credit Opportunity Act on behalf of a transgender plaintiff who alleged that I would say she was denied an opportunity to apply for a loan because the woman, it was a trans woman who was dressed female, and she was told that she needed to go home and dress in male clothing in order to apply for this loan. And then the last case for the exception to the trend of federal sex discrimination laws with Title VII was the Euler versus Winn-Dixie case. And this is the case with Peter Euler, who was a cross-dresser who was fired from his job when one of his coworkers saw him out at a club cross-dressed. He did not cross-dress on his job. He didn't want his job to know that he cross-dressed, but he was fired for cross-dressing outside of work time. And the courts did, basically, he did not win his case with the sex discrimination on that one. Yes?
Title VII talks about sex-based discrimination. It doesn't allude to gender. It doesn't allude to sexual orientation. Do you think, and again, I appreciate that you're not a lawyer, but do you think that our perceptions of sexual orientation are so tied to gender identification and sex that it's compelling to say, well, because you guys were using homophobic epithets against this individual, you didn't call him a sissy, you didn't question his sex itself, but do you think that's similar enough in the same vein that's a compelling enough argument, or do you think they really need to take a more proactive stance and say, no, we're gonna protect sexual orientation as well?
I think the way that sex discrimination has been interpreted has been about gender expression. I think there needs to be more explicit language about gender expression. I mean, on the other hand, often the language that is used by folks who are perpetrating hate or bias crime is homophobic. But it'll be interesting to see a cultural shift. If we continue to see more mainstream movies about transsexuals and transgender folks, will our language start to come into the mainstream, and then will it be used? Will we hear things like "you tranny freak"? I don't know. In a couple years, we may, because there has been more media attention about transgender people. Will that language shift? So.
Maybe 10 years ago, Mr. Oncal was this guy who was working in a casino, and he was openly gay, and his coworkers were using homophobic epithets against him, and the court said, well, that's all well and good, but we're not protecting sexual orientation. If they had called you a sissy, then we could intervene.
Right.
I mean, it seems so nuanced, and
I mean, sexual orientation definitely does need to be covered, and I think that's part of why we're looking at the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, or whatever they're going to call it this year on a federal level, as well as the hate crimes. Yes.
The most recent case law that I've read, and some of them were these cases where it was a discussion, this might have been where you got this, but looked at Title VII and had these different scenarios of people who, most of them was in the workplace, that they had been called either perceived or were gay or lesbian, and there are other moments of people who were, as you were saying, they'd say something homophobic, but they were straight,
right.
but it was about their gender. Right.
And they were saying that gender and sex are.
And a couple of those cases were successful on just under the gender argument, in that it's sex discrimination, that so the case law was just barely getting into, not just covering sex, this was a man,
Right.
it was covering gender expression and his gender expression. But the similar kind of arguments came up of reading sexuality as an expression of sex and a kind of offshoot of gender, and those were not successful. Those arguments weren't successful.
So then state sex discrimination laws is that we're seeing more state sex discrimination laws covering some transgender cases, and that states have uniformly interpreted state and local sex discrimination laws to include transsexual people. Some of the same cases, again, Sky versus Sky Publishing Corporation, Doe versus Brockton School Committee, which was a case of a transgender student who was told that they could not dress in that clothing. They needed to go home and put on more masculine clothing. It was a student who was on the M to F spectrum. And so the state did see that. Medicare does not pay for sex reassignment surgeries. And that's, I think, again, one of the misconceptions that the government is going to pay for these. The American Research Council folks did a whole study, supposedly, sent it around to Congress saying that Congress was paying, that our tax dollars were paying for sex reassignment surgeries. But Medicare does not pay for sex reassignment surgeries. But Medicaid does not have an exclusion for sex reassignment surgery, but almost every court has considered the issue is that they cannot categorically exclude sex reassignment surgeries from Medicaid coverage, but most of the Medicaid statutes contain blanket exclusions for the procedures related to sex reassignment surgery. So they don't exclude it, but then they don't cover it. So they got around that with a loophole. So some of the things that what I try to work on as an activist, I do a lot of work in the segregated type of social service places, homeless shelters, domestic violence shelters, places like that. We're trying to gather more statistics about transgender folks, particularly in the work that I do around anti-violence work, that when I started, we have to fill out forms for our funders, and most of our forms had male and female. So we weren't even gathering like how many trans people were accessing our services for a lot of these funders. The state police at one point came to our organization and said, we're seeing a large number of trans women being sexually assaulted, and there's no place for us to record it because we only have male and female. What should we do? So one of the things I talk about is expanding those boxes on our forms. Ultimately, it should just be a line and letting the person fill in what their gender identity is, but I highly doubt that that's what's going to happen. So adding more boxes to the forms are always helpful, particularly if you're male, female, M to F, F to M, and intersex, which we didn't talk about today. But for people to be able to self-identify, there are definitely going to be trans folks who are not going to check off that trans box or not going to want that checked off because, again, they may be at the point in their lives that they don't identify that way. They might feel like, this might out me somewhere. So for some people, they're not going to want to check that box. Trying to have policies that are respectful and include gender identity and gender expression in non-discrimination policies, whether that's just on campus, statewide, citywide, things like that. So pushing to make those changes. One of the things that we're doing in Massachusetts is we're in the process of trying to amend our non-discrimination law and our hate crimes law to include gender identity, gender expression, particularly because Senator Kennedy has been the big holdup when it comes to adding gender identity to those federal hate crimes law and the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. And I mean, really, his home state doesn't even have it, so it's time for us to make those moves. The problem that we've run into is that we have a state with, we have same-sex marriage and we're fighting to hold on to that. And so how do you have conversations about same-sex marriage and transgender folks and not let the anti-GLBT people kind of glob onto those and make them the same thing. So that's been a discussion we've been having in our community. Yes?
Is it more of a problem for reform apathy or that actually people don't want to help transgender people?
The problem comes in, usually when I did a lot of lobbying for the city ordinance in Boston. The second question that was usually asked of me is what bathrooms are these people going to use? There's such a fear around bathrooms, public restrooms, and unfortunately, when we were working on the lobbying at the time, we had a case on the Cape where a woman went into a public women's restroom and a man went in and sexually assaulted and murdered her. And he was not dressed as a woman to do it. The assumption is always about that men are going to dress as women to get into women's bathrooms. And we have to work through that. Trans folks are going to use the bathrooms that they feel safest in, and the last thing they want to do is call attention to themselves in a bathroom. When I travel, I'm an F to M, female to male. I have a big F on my driver's license, and I have to make a decision every time I go somewhere, what am I going to do? Do I go into the women's room and have women go, you're in the wrong restroom? Or poor old ladies will walk in, they'll see me, and they'll think they're in the wrong restroom. Then they go into the men's room, and it totally screws them up. Or, do I go into the men's room and risk, a guy going, what are you doing in here? And so my ultimate choice is a gender-neutral bathroom, but that's not always possible. So, depending on where I am and, thinking if I'm in Pennsylvania, there is a criminal charge for being in the wrong restroom. So my driver's license says female, so I go in the women's room. It's not the most ideal thing for me, but because if I get arrested, at least I can say my driver's license has an F on it. Like, don't arrest me. So really, it's about like kind of demystifying like the whole bathroom thing. That's really what it comes down to is bathrooms. Yes.
Actually, there was a case last year, and I think it was just district court, that had to do with a transsexual bus driver who, I guess the fear was she was driving on routes outside of, or I forget the exact details, but she was fired not because of being transgender, but what the employer was claiming was a fear of lawsuit based on somebody down the road, literally down the road. If this person used the wrong restroom, they'd get sued. And so they were sort of arguing a BFOQ kind of argument, or making it a legitimate business reasons. I forget how it turned out. Actually, I think the person's firing was upheld. Actually, but mostly because Title VII doesn't cover these things very clearly.
Right.
But I
And-
was actually wanted to ask a question. It seems like sometimes in the LGBT community, there's a question of, well, the T isn't the same, and so from the trans perspective, how do you see that alliance with the LGBT community, and do you feel that that's ultimately in the long term a helpful alliance, or with the backlash against LGBT community sometimes, is that actually a hindrance to furthering the cause?
I feel one, the trans community has always been with the LGBT community. Like Stonewall was the riots where trans people were right there beside. Like the LGBT community likes to erase us from a lot of history, but majority of those drag queens, some of them were transsexual women, and some of those butches were F to Ms. So I think part of it is that we've always been there. Some of the same issues affect trans people as they affect LGBT. When it comes to hate and bias crime, that our community is often lumped together. There's no distinction between the L, the G, the B, the T. And in order to make progress, we all need to start building coalitions, not just the LGBT, but we need to build coalitions with the immigrant and refugee community, with other communities of color, because some of these things cross over. I mean, a lot of the work, I do work around trafficking, and some of the immigration issues are also affecting trans people. The Real ID Act is one of them. That's a place that a lot of us came together. I was actually in a meeting yesterday, and one of the folks was from the American Friends Service Committee, and he was talking about how he was at this national meeting, and there was trans folks in there talking about the issues of the Real ID Act, and how some of them are very similar and some of them are not so similar, but that we needed to come together. And he said, this was the first time I was sitting in this room with the LGBT community talking about this, with the immigrant rights community. Like, we need to do more of that. Because it's about coalition building. Like the work I'm doing in Massachusetts around trying to change our law, we can't do it by ourselves. We're very small, the trans community is very small, and we're going to need our LGBT allies to do that, as well as lots of other allies. And I think that the LGBT community has also gotten some of their civil rights on the backs of trans people, and that they need to step up and start including the GLBT folks. And they're I have a lot of conversations around the marriage community, same-sex marriage, and trying to talk about having inside voice versus outside voice, because one of our concerns when talking about marriage is that we don't want DOMAs to then to say what a man and what a woman is. Right now they're saying one man, one woman, and what happens if they start defining what a man and a woman is? And that's our fear. And so one of the things I've been having discussions with is when you're talking within the community about marriage, it should be LGBT marriage and not same-sex. But outside the community, we call it same-sex marriage because we don't need to bring, that to light too. But I was at a group the other day, and half of the trans guys were all getting married or got married, because now they can do that because of same-sex marriage laws in Massachusetts. So. It is almost the end of the time, and I know that we have one announcement to make. Emily does have my contact information, and some of it's on the handouts. I want to thank you all for coming to this talk.